Hey, welcome to another chapter. I hope you guys are doing good. I hope you guys are having a really good week. I know things can be a bit tiring and stressful. But just stay with me and just stay the cause right now. Today we'll be looking at chapter 10, and chapter 10 is basically looking at aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Again, if you have any questions or you don't understand anything, please let me know. Send me an email, or if you want to talk to me about anything, just send me an email and I'll be more than happy to, just walk you through whatever you don't understand or whatever you need help with or whatever you want to talk about. I know things can get a bit confusing, but just remember that I'm here to help you as much as possible. Okay, so just don't go through things alone. Okay, right. So we're looking at chapter 10, and chapter 10 is basically looking at a model of real GDP and the price level. Okay, we know what real GDP is, and we even know how to calculate it at this point. Okay, we also know the price level and we know how to calculate it, but what influences real GDP and the price level in the economy? What basically influences or what basically changes real GDP or leads to economic growth? And what basically changes price level and leads to inflation in the economy? Okay. Right. So the tool we're basically going to use to sort of analyze real GDP and price level in the general macroeconomy is basically aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Okay, so this is the fundamental building block of understanding how the economy basically expands or contracts. Okay, right. So we basically gonna build on chapter 3, what we've already learned. We've already seen demand and we've already seen supply, but think of aggregate demand and aggregate supply as in adding all individual supply curves and adding all supply curves in the market. And think of aggregate demand as sort of adding all demand curves in the market as well. Okay. So learning objectives, again, I always go through the learning objectives because I believe that once you understand the learning objectives or once you master the learning objectives, you should be able to tackle any question from the chapter. Okay. Right. So first of all, we'll explain what determines aggregate supply in the long run and the short run. Okay. So we'll define aggregate supply in the short run and the long run. What does the short run mean? What does the long run even mean? Okay. We'll explain what is aggregate demand and what actually determines aggregate demand. We'll explain how real GDP and the price level are determined and what causes growth, inflation, and the business cycles, right? So these are the three major things we actually look at, okay? So now let's just get started, okay? The first thing we're going to look at is basically aggregate supply, okay? Right. But before we delve into the chapter, right, I just want you to sort of have this framework or this mindset that our whole purpose is basically to know how real GDP and the price level are determined in the economy, okay? And like I said earlier, the aggregate supply and demand model is similar to what we saw in chapter 3, right? So think of it all as demand and supply curves in the economy basically coming together, okay? Right, so the first thing we look at is quantity supplied and supply. Again, there's a difference between quantity supplied and supply, okay? So when you're looking at aggregate supply, again, you're looking at the general economy. Okay, so you're looking at the quantity of goods produced in the economy, which is basically GDP, versus the price of all those goods together, which is basically the price level. So in that sense, when we say the quantity supplied, right, we're talking about the quantity of real GDP supplied. And the quantity of real GDP supplied is the total quantity that firms or producers or sellers plan to sell or produce, okay, during a given time period, holding everything else constant. Okay, so that is the quantity of real GDP supplied. Okay, again, with supply, you always looking at things from the perspective of the firm or the producers, right? So, what is the total quantity that firms plan to produce during a given period, right? Holding everything else constant, okay? Now, aggregate supply, okay, looks at the relationship. So, aggregate supply is different from the quantity of GDP supplied or the quantity supplied, okay? Aggregate supply explores the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied, okay, and the price level. Okay, so we basically looking at how quantity of real GDP supplied, or how the total quantity that firms plan to produce in a given period is related to the price level in the economy. Okay, now with aggregate supply, we basically need to make two distinctions. Okay, we have aggregate supply in the long run. Okay, so in the long run, we're looking at 2 or more years. Okay, and we also have aggregate supply in the short run. Okay, so in the short run is basically less than 2 years. Okay, so now this is what we are basically looking at. Okay, right, first of all, the quantity of GDP supplied is the total quantity of goods and services firms, or the total amount of firms and producers and sellers in the economy want to produce at a given time period. Aggregate supply itself, or the aggregate supply curve, basically looks at the relationship between the quantity of goods produced or goods supplied, real GDP supplied, and their price level. Okay, and we need to make the distinction between the long run and again the short run. Okay, now the first thing we're going to look at is the long run aggregate supply. Okay, well, the long run aggregate supply looks at the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level. Okay, so again, we're still looking at the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level when real GDP equals potential GDP. And now we did talk about potential GDP in this class. Okay, remember we said potential GDP is the maximum output a country can produce if it decides to employ all its resources. So if it decides to employ all its machinery, all its land, all its labor, every single resource, that is the maximum amount of GDP the country can basically produce. Okay, right, now in the long run, which is basically 2 or more years, we sort of measure the economy based on its maximum of amount of resources the economy can produce. Okay, well, since the economy can produce a certain maximum amount of resources, regardless of whatever happens, if it decides to employ all these resources, potential GDP is independent of the price level. Okay, so in that sense, it means that the long run aggregate supply is also going to be independent of the price level. Okay, the long run aggregate supply is also going to be independent of the price level, because again, in the long run, regardless of what the price level is, if the country uses all its resources, it's going to produce a fixed amount. It's always, in that sense, going to be independent of the price level. Okay, right, and now we have the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so in the sense, the long run aggregate supply curve, we'll call it LAS, okay, is always going to be vertical at potential GDP. Okay, so it's always going to look vertical, and I'll actually draw that later. Okay, so we'll have the price level, we'll have quantity or real GDP at this point, and it's always going to look vertical. So the long run aggregate supply curve is going to look like that. Okay, it's going to be essentially vertical. Okay, right, now let's just move on to the short run aggregate supply curve. The short run aggregate supply curve, right, looks at the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level when all other factors remain constant. Note, is not looking at the quantity of real GDP supplied at the point where real GDP equals potential GDP, okay? Because in the short run, things are always changing. So the economy basically is not going to produce at potential GDP. Okay, the economy is not going to employ all these resources in the short run because it's too much of a short time period for it to basically do that. Okay, right, so we're looking at the relationship between the quantity of real GDP supplied and the price level. Okay, now we need to look at the behavior of producers. Remember, for producers, when prices increases, they actually tend to produce more. Okay, And think of aggregate supply as basically the total amount of supply or goods supplied by producers, okay? Right, so with a relationship in terms of price level and the quantity of real GDP supplied, okay, a rise in the price level increases the quantity of real GDP supplied. Again, there's a positive relationship between the price level in the economy and the quantity of real GDP supplied. In other words, as the price level increases, producers collectively want to sell more because they know they actually make more profit, so they actually produce more, okay? Hence, as the price level increases, quantity of real GDP supplied increases as well, okay? Right. And conversely, as the price level decreases, the quantity of real GDP supplied decreases as well. Okay, so the short run supply curve, which is basically SAS for short, is always going to be upward sloping. Okay, it's always going to be upward sloping. So you have price and you have quantity over here, which is basically GDP, and is always going to be upward sloping. Okay, so SAS is upward sloping. As the price level increases, okay, so let's say we are point A and we move to point B. As the price level increases, quantity of real GDP supplied, so this is quantity in terms of real GDP, will increase as well. Okay, quantity of real GDP supply will basically increase as well. Okay. Now we need to know what is going to change the aggregate supply. Again, changes in the aggregate supply curve eventually will help us predict price level and real GDP in the economy. It's basically like what we did in chapter 3 in terms of demand and supply. It's basically like what we did in chapter 7 in terms of the loanables funds market. We want these curves to change so we know what will happen to certain variables or figures in the economy. Okay, right. So changes in aggregate supply happens, okay, when an influence of any factor on production plans other than the price level changes. Remember, when the price level changes, there's a change in quantity of real GDP supplied, okay? If any factor other than the price level changes, okay, is going to change the aggregate supply curve, meaning the whole curve is actually going to shift, okay? Now you need to know what factors will cause the aggregate supply curve to basically shift, okay? These are really important, okay? Right, now the first one is what we call changes in potential GDP, okay? So changes in potential GDP will cause both the long run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve to both change, okay? This is something you need to know, okay? And then also changes in the money wage rate, and we'll explain these later, okay? Changes in the money wage rate, right? And when we say the money wage rate, we're talking about basically changes in wages, okay? So this is essentially changes in wages. It's a funny way of saying changes in wages. We say money wage because this has not been accounted for inflation and other factor prices. We said the factors of production are land, capital, labor, okay? Maybe if machinery become expensive or they become cheaper, right? Other factor prices only affect the short run aggregate curve, okay? So the only thing that basically will shift the long run aggregate curve is essentially potential GDP, okay? Right, so changes in potential GDP affects the long run aggregate supply curve and also the short run aggregate supply curve, but changes in money wage rates or changes in cost of production of other factors of production will only affect the short run aggregate supply curve, okay? Now, the next thing we need to look at is basically changes in potential GDP. What will lead to changes in potential GDP? Okay, well, changes in potential GDP, right? Basically, for example, if potential GDP increases, then LAS and SAS curves will shift rightward. Okay, so changes in potential GDP will actually change. We know the long run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. Okay, right, now changes in potential GDP happens for three distinct reasons. Okay, changes in potential GDP happens in a country if there's an increase in what we call full employment quantity of labor. So anything that actually increases employment of labor is going to affect potential GDP. Okay, so an increase in the full employment quantity of labor, okay, will actually increase potential GDP. The larger the quantity of labor employed, the more workers a country basically has, the more it can produce. Okay, so if you're actually schooling more people and you're training more people, right, the country can actually employ more workers. So there's a huge influx of immigration. The country can actually employ more workers and hence produce more. Okay, so that is what we mean by full employment quantity of labor, right? This is the amount of workers needed to actually reach full employment or potential GDP. Okay, another thing that will cause potential GDP to increase is an increase in the quantity of capital. Okay, so this is an increase in machinery, in equipment, in buildings used to make goods and services. Okay, an increase in capital means you can actually produce more goods and services, and hence potential GDP can change. Okay, and then finally we have an advance in technology. Okay, an increase in technology will actually cause potential GDP to change. Now, as you're looking at this, likewise, a decrease in any of these will cause potential GDP to decrease as well. A decrease in the full employment quantity of labor will cause potential GDP to decrease. A decrease in the quantity of capital will cause potential GDP to decrease. And a decrease in technology will cause potential GDP to decrease as well. Now, remember, changes in potential GDP affects both the long run aggregate supply curve and the short run aggregate supply curve as well. So I'm going to show you how this basically looks like. Okay, so this figure shows basically aggregate supply in the long run and short run aggregate supply. Again, we have the price level over here, which is measured by the GDP deflator. We didn't really talk about the GDP deflator, but the GDP deflator is another way of measuring the price level. And we have real GDP over here as well. Just know the price level is here, and know that real GDP is here. Like I said, long run aggregate supply curve is vertical, so regardless of what the price level is, it's always going to be the same. For this country, long run aggregate supply curve is basically 18. Okay, and then the short run aggregate supply curve is basically upward sloping, right? Because it's dependent on the price level. Okay, and as you notice, the short run aggregate supply curve in some cases is actually more than the long run aggregate supply curve. Why? It means that if that happens, it means that the country is overproducing. Okay, it means that the country is overproducing. And if the short run aggregate supply curve is less than the long run aggregate supply curve, it means the country tends to be underproducing. Now, let's see what happens if there's an increase in potential GDP. If there's an increase in potential GDP, remember the long aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, and the short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right as well. Okay, right, so the long run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, and the short run aggregate supply curve will basically shift to the right. Okay, till the point, to the point where the new equilibrium, let's call this A and let's call this B, to the point where the new equilibrium is equal to the original price level. Okay, because the long run, basically, aggregate supply does not depend on the price level, so it's going to shift in such a way that the price level won't change, but what would change is the total GDP in the country, okay, or the total amount of GDP in the country. So the only thing that's changing is potential GDP, which is basically from an increase from 18 to 19. Okay, by the long run, since potential GDP is independent of the price level, the price level will basically stay the same. This is really important, okay? The price level will still stay the same, okay? So the short-run aggregate supply curve will change and adjust in such a way that when it actually has a new equilibrium with the long-run aggregate supply curve, the price level basically still stays the same, right? Okay. Now, let's look at changes in the money wage rate. Okay, we said changes in the money wage rate or changes in other factors of production basically are going to affect only the short-run aggregate supply curve. Now, if the short-run aggregate supply curve, right, for example, if there's a rise in the money wage rate, okay, the money wage rate will not change the long-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, it will only change the short-run aggregate supply curve. A rise in the money wage rate increases firms' cost. Why? Because firms have to pay more to workers, at least in the short run. Okay. So in that sense, it actually increases firms' cost. Firms don't hire as much workers, okay, because they have to pay workers more. So since they're not hiring as much workers, they can't produce as much goods and services. So in the short run, they'll basically cut production. Okay. Right. So when there's an increase in the money wage rate, okay, the short run aggregate supply curve will decrease because supply decreases, okay, because they're cutting down on production. And the short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, okay. But the long run aggregate supply curve does not change, okay. So you basically get to a new equilibrium, okay. And eventually you get to a new equilibrium where you have B here, okay? And the only thing that would change, right, is basically the price level. So the price level will rise, but nothing will actually affect potential GDP, right? Because potential GDP doesn't even change in the first place, okay? The only thing that will change is basically the price level. So the country will basically still produce the same amount of good, but the price level will actually increase. Okay. Now, I want you guys to take a look at these scenarios and see what will happen to aggregate supply, okay, and the quantity of real GDP supplied when universities in the US decrease the number of engineering graduates, okay, so there are less workers in the economy, when the money wage rate decreases, and when the price level basically increases, okay? Try and see if you can solve this using the examples I've given and using the concepts I've given, okay? Just try and work through this and we'll come back and then I'll work through this with you, okay? Thank you.